The dense forest fell silent. 2,000 Ashanti warriors lay in wait, their bodies pressed against the earth, weapons ready. Among them stood Amanquatia, the chief of Bantama and general of the Asanteheni's army. His reputation as a military genius had spread far beyond the borders of the mighty Ashanti Empire. Now, on January 31st, 1874, at the village of Amoaful, he prepared to make his final stand against the advancing British forces. The fate of an empire rested on his shoulders. The story of Amanquatia is not merely a tale of military conflict. It is a saga of strategic brilliance, unwavering loyalty, and tragic sacrifice. In the annals of African resistance to European colonization, few figures embody the fierce determination and tactical ingenuity that defined the Ashanti response to British imperial ambitions. Yet, despite his pivotal role in one of Africa's most significant anti-colonial struggles, Amanquatia's name has often been relegated to the footnotes of history, overshadowed by European narratives of conquest. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War of 1873 to 1874 marked a critical turning point in West African history. As British colonial ambitions expanded across the Gold Coast, they inevitably collided with the powerful Ashanti Empire, a sophisticated kingdom whose military prowess had dominated the region for centuries. At the center of this clash stood Amanquatia, whose military strategies would earn him recognition even from his enemies. Admirable skill was shown in the position selected by Amanquatia, wrote British commander Major General Garnet Wolseley.
And the determination and generalship he displayed in the defense fully bore out his reputation as an able tactician and gallant soldier.
Such praise from an adversary speaks volumes about the man who orchestrated what many consider to be the last great stand of the Ashanti against European encroachment. From his brilliant offensive campaign of 1873 that nearly captured the British stronghold at Cape Coast, to his ingenious defensive tactics at Amoaful, where he positioned his forces in forest cover and ridges overlooking bogs through which the British had to wade, Amanquatia demonstrated a level of military sophistication that challenged European assumptions about African warfare. Even after being demoted from his position as commander, a political decision that would prove catastrophic for the Ashanti, he fought with distinction until his final breath on the battlefield. As we journey through the remarkable life and death of this Ashanti general, we will explore not just the military campaigns that defined his career, but also the complex political landscape of 19th century West Africa, the sophisticated military traditions of the Ashanti Empire, and the tragic irony of a brilliant commander whose strategic advice was ignored at the most critical moment in his nation's history. This is the story of Amanquatia, the gallant general of Asante, whose legacy continues to resonate in Ghana today as a symbol of resistance, strategic brilliance, and ultimate sacrifice in defense of his homeland. Long before European powers carved up the African continent, the Ashanti Empire stood as one of West Africa's most formidable kingdoms. Emerging in the late 17th century under the leadership of Osei Tutu and his priest Okomfo Anokye, the Ashanti unified various Akan-speaking states into a powerful confederation centered around the Golden Stool, a sacred symbol believed to contain the soul of the Ashanti nation. By the early 19th century, the empire controlled vast territories in what is now modern Ghana, with influence extending into parts of present-day Togo and Côte d'Ivoire. The Ashanti Empire was not merely a political entity, but a sophisticated civilization with complex administrative structures, advanced metallurgy, vibrant artistic traditions, and elaborate diplomatic protocols. At its heart was Kumasi, a magnificent capital described by European visitors as a city of remarkable cleanliness and order, with wide streets, royal palaces, and bustling markets that drew traders from across West Africa and beyond. Central to the Ashanti's rise and continued dominance was their exceptional military organization. The empire maintained one of Africa's most disciplined and effective fighting forces, capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of warriors for campaigns. Military service was not merely an occupation, but a fundamental aspect of Ashanti citizenship and identity. Every able-bodied man was expected to serve when called upon, creating a society where martial values permeated daily life. The Ashanti military structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At its apex stood the Asantehene, king, who held supreme command. Below him were various chiefs who led contingents from their respective territories. Among these chiefs, few positions carried more military significance than the Bantamahene, the chief of Bantama. As guardian of the royal mausoleum, where the remains of past Asantehenes were interred, the Bantamahene held both spiritual and military authority. He was traditionally responsible for the defense of Kumasi and often served as the field commander of Ashanti forces during major campaigns. The title of Bantamahene was not merely hereditary, but required demonstrated military acumen. Throughout Ashanti history, several individuals bearing the name Amanquatia held this prestigious position. Historical accounts mention an Amanquatia as early as 1715. Another Amanquatia commanded Ashanti armies in 1814, securing an indecisive victory over the Akim and Aquapem. These earlier Amanquatias established a legacy of military leadership that our protagonist, the Amanquatia of the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, would inherit and ultimately define. Ashanti warfare was characterized by sophisticated tactics rather than mere numerical advantage. Their armies employed complex formations, ambush techniques, and strategic use of terrain. Firearms had been integrated into Ashanti military technology since the 18th century, with the empire maintaining trade relationships that ensured access to European weapons. By the mid-19th century, the Ashanti army possessed thousands of muskets and had developed effective firing drills that impressed even European observers. The Ashanti approach to war was not simply about battlefield prowess, but encompassed comprehensive strategic thinking. Military campaigns were preceded by extensive intelligence gathering, diplomatic maneuvering, and logistical preparation. The empire's network of roads, radiating from Kumasi like spokes from a hub, facilitated rapid troop movements and effective communication. This infrastructure would prove crucial during the Anglo-Ashanti conflicts, allowing for the swift deployment of forces to threatened areas. It was into this proud military tradition that the Amanquatia of our story emerged. As Bantamahene under Asantehene Kofi Karikari, he inherited not only a position of tremendous responsibility, but also the weight of centuries of Ashanti military excellence. When the gathering storm of British colonial ambition finally broke upon the shores of the Gold Coast, it would be Amanquatia who would stand as the empire's shield, drawing upon the full depth of Ashanti martial tradition to defend his homeland against the most technologically advanced military power of the 19th century. The collision between British imperial ambitions and Ashanti sovereignty was not sudden, but developed through decades of increasing tension and sporadic conflict. The Gold Coast, with its lucrative trade opportunities and strategic position, had long attracted European powers. By the early 19th century, the coastline was dotted with forts controlled by various European nations, primarily the British, Dutch, and Danish. These coastal enclaves existed in an uneasy relationship with the powerful Ashanti Empire that dominated the interior. The First Anglo-Ashanti War, 1823 to 1831, established a pattern that would characterize future conflicts. It began when the Ashanti claimed territory disputed with the Fante, a coastal people who had aligned themselves with the British. The war saw initial Ashanti victories, including the defeat of British forces at the Battle of Amoaful in 1824, where British Governor Sir Charles McCarthy was killed. Eventually, the conflict ended with the Ashanti accepting the Pra River as the boundary between their territory and British protected lands. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War, 1863 to 1864, proved indecisive. An Ashanti force crossed the Pra River in pursuit of a fugitive, leading to clashes with British, African, and Indian troops. However, disease claimed more casualties than combat on both sides, and the conflict ended in stalemate. This inconclusive outcome left fundamental tensions unresolved, setting the stage for a more decisive confrontation. By the early 1870s, several factors combined to make another war virtually inevitable. The first catalyst came in 1869, when a group of European missionaries, including German and Swiss nationals, were taken captive by the Ashanti. While the missionaries were treated hospitably in Kumasi, their detention became a point of diplomatic friction and provided a pretext for increased British involvement in the region. The more significant trigger, however, was the changing European presence along the coast. In 1871, the Dutch sold their Gold Coast territories to the British, including the strategically important port of Elmina. This transaction fundamentally altered the regional balance of power. For centuries, the Ashanti had maintained favorable trading relationships with the Dutch, who served as their primary access point to European goods, particularly firearms. More importantly, the Ashanti had long claimed Elmina as their territory, considering it a tributary state. The British purchase of Elmina represented not merely a commercial transaction between European powers, but, from the Ashanti perspective, an illegitimate transfer of their sovereign territory. Asante Kofi Karikari articulated this position clearly in his March 1873 letter to Governor Harley.
His Majesty states that he, being the grandson of Osei Tutu, he owns the Elminas to be his relatives, and consequently the fort at Elmina and its dependencies being his. He could not understand the administrator-in-chief's sending Atta, alias Mr. H. Plange, to tell him of his having taken possession of them.
The British, meanwhile, were consolidating their position on the Gold Coast. In 1867, they had formally established the British Gold Coast colony, and the acquisition of Dutch territories in 1871 significantly expanded their claims. Unlike previous conflicts where the British had primarily sought to protect their coastal interests, a new imperial calculus was emerging. As the scramble for Africa gained momentum, British strategic thinking increasingly favored direct control over indirect influence. This shift in British policy was evident in the correspondence of the period. General Wolseley's October 1873 letter to Cardwell stated bluntly,
"There is, sir, but one method of freeing these settlements from the continued menace of Ashanti invasion, and this is to defeat the Ashanti army in the field, to drive it from the protected territories, and, if necessary, to pursue it into its own land, and to march victorious on the Ashanti capital."
The Ashanti, perceiving these existential threats to their sovereignty, responded with force. In 1873, under the command of Amanquatia, Ashanti forces crossed the Pra River and invaded British-protected territories. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War had begun, a conflict that would test Amanquatia's generalship against the might of the British Empire, and ultimately change the course of West African history. In early 1873, as tensions reached their breaking point, Asante Kofi Karikari appointed Amanquatia to lead what would become one of the most ambitious military campaigns in Ashanti history. As Bantamaheni, Amanquatia already commanded tremendous respect within the military hierarchy. Now, he was entrusted with the defense of the empire itself against the expanding British presence. The scale of the force assembled under Amanquatia's command reflected the seriousness with which the Ashanti viewed the threat. Contemporary accounts place the number at approximately 80,000 warriors, a massive army by any standard of the era. This force represented not just the military might of the Ashanti heartland, but contingents from various tributary states and allies, creating a diverse but formidable fighting force. Amanquatia's first strategic decision demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of military operations. Rather than advancing as a single unwieldy mass, he divided his army into two distinct columns. The larger force, under his direct command, would push westward toward Elmina, the focal point of the territorial dispute, and the British administrative center at Cape Coast. A smaller but still substantial force would move eastward toward Accra, threatening British interests across a broad front and preventing the concentration of defensive forces. This two-pronged approach revealed Amanquatia's grasp of strategic principles that would have been recognized by military theorists in any part of the world. By creating multiple threats, he forced his opponents to divide their limited resources. The eastern thrust served as both a genuine military objective and a strategic diversion, preventing the British from focusing solely on defending their key positions in the west. The initial phases of the campaign unfolded largely according to plan. The Eastern Column achieved significant victories against British Allied forces, while Amanquatia's main army steadily pushed southward toward the coast. Ashanti warriors, familiar with the terrain and accustomed to the climate, moved through the dense forest with an ease that their European opponents could not match. Traditional Ashanti military discipline maintained cohesion despite the challenging environment. By mid-1873, Amanquatia had achieved what many considered impossible. His forces had reached the outskirts of Cape Coast, the primary British stronghold on the Gold Coast. Simultaneously, much of Elmina had fallen under Ashanti control. The British position appeared precarious, with only a few hundred men available to defend Cape Coast against the much larger Ashanti force. It was at this critical juncture that Amanquatia made a decision that would later be endlessly debated by military historians. Despite having the British forces at a significant disadvantage, he chose not to launch a full assault on Cape Coast. The reasons for this decision remain somewhat unclear in historical records. Some accounts suggest he was adhering to traditional Ashanti military practices that favored negotiation after demonstrating military superiority. Others propose more practical considerations: concerns about attacking fortified positions or uncertainty about the exact strength of the British defenses. Whatever the reasoning, this pause proved consequential. The British used the reprieve to rapidly reinforce their position, importing thousands of Hausa mercenaries and requesting additional British troops from other colonies. What had been a moment of acute vulnerability for the colonial forces gradually transformed into a more defensible position. As the campaign extended beyond its planned duration, Amanquatia's army began to encounter serious logistical challenges. The Ashanti military system, while sophisticated, had been designed primarily for shorter campaigns within or near their traditional territories. Sustaining a large force at the end of extended supply lines proved increasingly difficult. By late 1873, these challenges had become critical. Gunpowder supplies dwindled to the point where Amanquatia was forced to implement strict rationing among his troops. Contemporary accounts describe Ashanti warriors firing muskets with insufficient powder, resulting in slugs that traveled at reduced velocity and caused only minor injuries rather than fatal wounds. Many soldiers were equipped with obsolete smoothbore muskets instead of the more modern rifles that had been standard in previous campaigns. Food shortages proved even more problematic. Amanquatia had planned for a swift, decisive campaign rather than a prolonged occupation. As local resources were exhausted, feeding the large army became increasingly difficult. The situation was exacerbated by British naval control of coastal waters, which prevented resupply by sea. Facing these mounting challenges and the arrival of British reinforcements, Amanquatia made the difficult decision to withdraw his forces back across the Pra River. This retreat, while strategically necessary, marked the end of the Ashanti offensive. More significantly, it damaged Amanquatia's standing in Kumasi, where military success was the primary measure of leadership. Despite the ultimate withdrawal, Amanquatia's 1873 campaign demonstrated remarkable strategic vision and operational skill. He had projected Ashanti power farther than many thought possible, brought the British colonial presence to the brink of disaster, and established a reputation that caused genuine concern in London. That he did not deliver the decisive blow at Cape Coast would prove to be a turning point, not just in his career, but in the history of the Ashanti Empire itself. As Amanquatia's forces withdrew across the Pra River in late 1873, the British government was already planning a decisive response. The Ashanti offensive, while ultimately contained, had exposed the vulnerability of British positions on the Gold Coast and created political pressure in London for a more permanent solution to the Ashanti problem. The British response came in the form of Major General Sir Garnet Wolseley, a rising star in the British military with experience in colonial campaigns. Appointed on August 13, 1873, Wolseley was given a clear mandate, not merely to repel Ashanti forces, but to march on Kumasi itself and secure terms that would permanently diminish Ashanti power in the region. Wolseley approached the campaign with methodical precision. Before the arrival of his main force, he traveled to the Gold Coast personally to assess the situation and develop detailed plans. On September 27, 1873, a team of Royal Engineers landed at Cape Coast Castle with orders to construct a road from the coast to Kumasi, a distance of approximately 160 miles through dense forest and difficult terrain. This infrastructure project, unprecedented in scale for the region, reflected the British commitment to a decisive campaign. The force assembled under Wolseley's command represented the full might of Victorian Britain's imperial military machine. The corps consisted of 2,500 British troops drawn from elite regiments, supplemented by several thousand West Indian and African soldiers, including Fante allies with long-standing grievances against the Ashanti. Unlike previous British forces in the region, Wolseley's army was equipped with the latest military technology, including the devastating Maxim gun, an early machine gun that could deliver unprecedented firepower. Beyond technological superiority, the British force benefited from two critical advantages. First, the introduction of quinine as a preventative treatment for malaria significantly reduced the impact of disease. Historically, the greatest killer of European forces in West Africa. Second, the campaign received unprecedented logistical support, with regular supply shipments from Britain ensuring that Wolseley's troops would not face the shortages that had plagued Amanquatia's army. The British invasion began in January 1874, with Wolseley's forces crossing the Pra River and entering Ashanti territory. The advance followed two main routes. Wolseley led the larger force directly through Adansi toward Kumasi, while a smaller column moved northwest from Akiem Swedru toward Juaben, with plans to converge on the capital. In Kumasi, the Ashanti leadership faced difficult decisions about how to respond to this unprecedented threat. It was here that Amanquatia experienced perhaps the most bitter moment of his military career. Despite having led the Ashanti army with a distinction during the 1873 offensive, he found himself demoted from his position as commander. Contemporary accounts suggest that he had thoroughly lost any support he once enjoyed in Kumasi following the withdrawal from Cape Coast. In Amanquatia's place, Asantehene Kofi Karikari appointed an aging general named Nkwanta as commander of the Ashanti army. This decision proved immediately controversial within Ashanti military and political circles. The king of Juaben, a key Ashanti ally and supporter of Amanquatia, protested the appointment by withholding his well-armed contingent of 20,000 soldiers, a devastating blow to Ashanti military strength at a critical moment. Nkwanta's strategy differed significantly from the approach Amanquatia had advocated. Rather than engaging the British near the Pra River, Nkwanta planned to draw the invaders deep into Ashanti territory, where they could be ambushed and encircled when overextended. While Amanquatia had been demoted from overall command, he remained a significant military figure as Bantamaheni and continued to play a crucial role in planning the Ashanti defense. Military historians suggest that the defensive position selected for the coming battle bore the hallmarks of Amanquatia's tactical genius, even if he no longer held supreme command. As January 1874 progressed, the British advance continued steadily, despite challenging terrain and sporadic Ashanti resistance. Wolseley's forces defeated an Ashanti contingent at the Battle of Eganasi near Bekwai, pushing deeper into Ashanti territory. Nkwanta's strategy of drawing the British further inland appeared to be working, setting the stage for what both sides anticipated would be the decisive engagement of the war. That confrontation would come at the village of Amoaful, also recorded as Amofo in some accounts, where Amanquatia would make his final stand. Despite his demotion, it would be here that he would demonstrate the full measure of his military genius, and where the fate of the Ashanti Empire would ultimately be decided. Dawn broke over the village of Amoaful on January 31st, 1874, revealing nothing of the drama about to unfold. To British eyes, the landscape appeared as just another stretch of the dense forest they had been traversing for weeks. But concealed within this seemingly ordinary terrain, Amanquatia had prepared what military historians now recognize as a masterpiece of defensive positioning. Despite his demotion from overall command, Amanquatia's expertise in battlefield tactics remained unquestioned. As Bantamaheni, He retained significant authority, and the defensive plan implemented at Amoaful bore all the hallmarks of his strategic thinking. The position he selected brilliantly exploited the natural features of the landscape to maximize Ashanti advantages and neutralize British strengths. The core of Amanquatia's defensive strategy involved positioning Ashanti forces along forested ridges that overlooked boggy lowlands. The British would have no choice but to advance through these waterlogged areas, slowing their movement and disrupting their formations. Meanwhile, Ashanti warriors would remain concealed in the dense forest cover, able to deliver devastating fire from positions of relative safety. The deployment formed a massive crescent, with the strongest forces concentrated at the center, where Amanquatia himself would command. The flanks extended outward, threatening to envelop any force that penetrated too deeply. This classic ambush formation had been used by Ashanti forces for generations, but never on such a scale or against such a technologically superior opponent. As Wolseley's forces approached Amoaful, they had little indication of the trap awaiting them. British reconnaissance had been hampered by the dense vegetation and the skill with which the Ashanti had concealed their positions. The advance guard, a unit known as the Black Watch, moved forward into what appeared to be light resistance. The battle began in earnest, when this forward unit suddenly found itself under intense fire from seemingly all directions. Ashanti marksmen, invisible in the forest, poured volley after volley into the British ranks. Using a technique of coordinated fire that surprised European observers, the Ashanti maintained a continuous barrage that pinned down the Black Watch and inflicted heavy casualties. According to Wolseley's own later writings, more than a fourth of the men in the regiment were either killed or grievously injured. The precision of Ashanti fire and the effectiveness of their ambush tactics temporarily stalled the British advance, creating a moment of genuine crisis for Wolseley's carefully planned expedition. For several hours, the battle hung in the balance. The Ashanti forces under Amanquatia's direct leadership at the center of their line maintained disciplined fire and successfully contained British attempts to outflank their position. The natural obstacles of bog and dense vegetation further complicated British movements, just as Amanquatia had anticipated. However, the same logistical challenges that had plagued the Ashanti Campaign of 1873 re-emerged at this critical moment. Despite careful preparation, ammunition supplies proved insufficient for a prolonged engagement against British forces. As the battle continued, Ashanti units began to exhaust their powder and shot, forcing them to reduce their rate of fire precisely when maximum pressure was needed. Sensing this reduction in Ashanti firepower, Wolseley ordered a counterattack. British forces, with their superior rifles and abundant ammunition, began to push back against the Ashanti positions. The technological gap between the forces became increasingly apparent as the battle progressed. British Martini Henry rifles, with their longer range and greater accuracy, allowed effective fire against Ashanti positions that had previously been secure. It was during this phase of the battle that Amanquatia demonstrated not just his tactical brilliance, but his personal courage. Recognizing the growing crisis, he moved along the Ashanti line, rallying his warriors and coordinating a fighting retreat to prevent a complete collapse. Contemporary accounts from both sides describe him as being conspicuous in his leadership, directly exposing himself to enemy fire as he sought to maintain the integrity of the Ashanti position. This visibility, while inspiring to his troops, made Amanquatia a target. As British forces pressed their advantage, advancing up the ridge lines that had previously sheltered Ashanti marksmen, Amanquatia found himself in the thick of the fighting. It was here, defending the center of the Ashanti line, that he fell, struck down alongside the king of Mampong and numerous other Ashanti leaders. The death of Amanquatia marked the turning point of the battle. Without his leadership, the Ashanti defense began to fragment. What had been a coordinated resistance transformed into isolated pockets of fighters, increasingly outflanked and overwhelmed by British firepower. By the end of the day, the Battle of Amoaful had become a decisive British victory. The cost had been high on both sides. British forces suffered significant casualties, particularly among the Black Watch regiment that had borne the brunt of the initial Ashanti ambush. But for the Ashanti, the losses were catastrophic, not just in terms of the thousands of warriors killed or wounded, but in the death of Amanquatia himself, whose strategic genius had represented perhaps the empire's best hope of repelling the invasion. In the aftermath of the battle, even as British forces celebrated their victory, there was recognition of the extraordinary challenge they had faced. Wolseley, not typically given to praising his adversaries, paid remarkable tribute to Amanquatia.
The great chief Amanquatia was among the killed, and the king of Mampon was wounded, while many other chiefs bit the dust. Admirable skill was shown in the position selected by Amanquatia, and the determination and generalship he displayed in the defense fully bore out his reputation as an able tactician and gallant soldier.
With Amanquatia dead and the Ashanti army scattered, British forces faced little resistance as they advanced on Kumasi. On February 4th, 1874, just 4 days after the Battle of Amoaful, Wolseley's troops entered the Ashanti capital. They found a city largely abandoned. Asante Kofi Karikari and much of the royal court had retreated into the forest, taking many valuables with them, but leaving behind a still impressive capital that spoke to the sophistication and wealth of the Ashanti civilization. The British occupation of Kumasi was brief but devastating. Wolseley ordered the systematic looting of the royal palace, with countless treasures, golden regalia, ceremonial swords, intricate jewelry, and sacred objects seized as war trophies. Many of these priceless artifacts were transported to Britain, where they remain in museums and private collections to this day, subjects of ongoing repatriation debates. After the looting came destruction. The royal palace, administrative buildings, and significant portions of the city were put to the torch. The British justified this as military necessity, but the cultural and psychological impact on the Ashanti people was immense. Kumasi had been not just a political capital, but a spiritual center, and its desecration represented a profound blow to Ashanti identity. As British forces withdrew from the smoldering ruins of Kumasi, they were met by Ashanti messengers seeking terms. The resulting Treaty of Fomena, signed in July 1874, formalized the British victory in harsh terms. The Ashanti were forced to renounce claims to Elmina and other coastal territories, as well as to numerous southern regions, including Denchire, Achim, and other areas that had previously been Ashanti tributaries. A massive indemnity of 50,000 ounces of gold was imposed, an amount deliberately calculated to strain Ashanti resources. The political fallout within the Ashanti Empire was immediate. Kofi Karikari, having lost the war and signed away significant territories, faced mounting opposition from chiefs and elders. Within months of the treaty's signing, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his brother, Mensa Bonsu. This political instability would continue to plague the Ashanti for years, weakening their ability to resist further British encroachment. For the British, the Third Anglo-Ashanti War represented a significant imperial triumph. Wolseley returned to Britain as a national hero, his reputation secured by the successful campaign. The victory expanded British control in West Africa and contributed to the momentum of the scramble for Africa that would see European powers divide the continent among themselves in the coming decades. The tragic irony of Amanquatia's career lies in his demotion before the decisive battle. Military historians have long speculated about how the war might have unfolded had he retained overall command of Ashanti forces. His successful 1873 offensive had demonstrated his ability to project power and exploit enemy weaknesses. Would he have chosen different defensive positions, implemented different tactics? The questions remain unanswerable, but highlight the pivotal role of individual leadership in historical outcomes. In Ashanti oral tradition and cultural memory, Amanquatia occupies a place of honor as a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Stories of his courage at Amoaful, standing firm even as British bullets cut down his fellow warriors, have been passed down through generations. His name has become synonymous with patriotic defense of homeland against foreign aggression.